What if your silence could destroy someone's ego more effectively than any insult ever could? Not by yelling, not by defending yourself, not by arguing until you're blue in the face, but by saying absolutely nothing and letting them unravel. See, Nietzsche didn't believe in playing by society's rules. He believed in overcoming them, in outgrowing the herd. And sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to say nothing at all. That kind of silence, it's not passive. It's not weakness. It's power in its purest form. The kind that confuses people, unbalances them, exposes their insecurities, and forces them to reveal way more than they meant to. In this video, you'll learn how to use silence the way Nietzsche would. Not just to avoid conflict, but to win without lifting a finger, to take control of any situation, to command a room without saying a word. If you're tired of reacting, if you're done explaining yourself to people who never deserve that access, then like the video, subscribe if you're new, and comment below. I choose silence over submission. That's not just for the algorithm, that's a declaration, a shift, a line in the sand. Because from this point on, we stop playing the game and start mastering it. Now let's begin with the first thing Nietzsche understood better than most. Why the people who talk the most often have the least power. Silence over submission. If you just type that in the comments, you've already taken your first step toward breaking the illusion that most people live in. Here's what I mean. Most people think power is loud. They think it looks like a raised voice, a strong opinion, a clever comeback. But what Nietzsche saw, what most people miss, is that this noise is usually a mask. People talk not because they know, but because they're scared of being found out. They explain, defend, overshare, trying to prove something, trying to be accepted, trying to be seen. But underneath that performance, insecurity, the desperate need to be validated. That's the herd instinct Nietzsche warned us about, the psychological glue that holds mediocrity together. You see it everywhere, on social media, in classrooms, at dinner tables. People fighting to be heard, not because they have something to say, but because they don't know who they are without the attention. They talk so they don't have to feel the silence, because silence is a mirror, and most people don't like what they'd see in it. Nietzsche understood this deeply. He wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow." But here's the part no one adds. He who needs to explain his why to everyone probably hasn't really found it yet. True confidence doesn't advertise itself. You don't need to tell people who you are. You become someone whose presence says it for you. That's what unnerves people. When you don't react the way they expect, when you don't rush to explain yourself, they start to feel the void. And in that void, their own insecurities echo back at them louder than anything you could have said. This is how silence becomes power. Not passive, not timid, but solid, centered, intentional. Because once you no longer need validation, once you stop explaining, defending, proving, you become unpredictable, unshakable, dangerous. You become someone who doesn't ask for respect. You become someone whose silence demands it. But this kind of silence isn't easy. It means you have to stop playing the game that everyone else is addicted to, reacting. And that's exactly what we'll break down next. Because the next level of power isn't just staying silent, it's knowing when not to react, even when everything inside you wants to. Let's get into it. Here's what Nietzsche understood, and most people never will. When you say nothing, people hear everything. Not your words, their own thoughts, their fears, their stories, their insecurities. They project all of it into the silence. And that's where your real leverage begins. Because in a world addicted to noise, silence is not neutral, it's charged. It becomes a mirror. A space where people are forced to confront themselves without your interference. And what they see? It's often uncomfortable. That's why most people keep talking, not to express truth, but to run from it. When you stay silent, especially in moments of tension, you force the other person to wrestle with their own uncertainty. Did I say something wrong? Are they angry? Do they know something I don't? They spiral. And you? You remain still, controlled, calm, quiet. And that stillness, it terrifies them. Because silence removes their grip on the narrative. It gives them nothing to latch onto, no words to argue against, no energy to feed off. You become a psychological black hole, They throw out bait, questions, accusations, emotional hooks, but nothing comes back. So they start unraveling. And that's the mirror Nietzsche was talking about. Silence is worse. All truths that are kept silent become poisonous. Nietzsche. But here's the twist. The poison doesn't touch you. It stays in them. Because silence doesn't just expose the other person's weakness, it makes them feel it. People reveal far more when they're trying to fill silence than when they're answering a question. They start oversharing, justifying, guessing your thoughts, confessing things you never asked about. Not because you interrogated them, but because you didn't. You let the silence do the work. You ever notice how uncomfortable most people get after just a few seconds of quiet in a conversation? They shift, they laugh nervously, they repeat themselves. They'll say things like, "You know what I mean?" Or, "Are you mad?" They can't sit in the unknown, because the unknown forces them to think, and thinking forces them to see themselves, maybe for the first time. And that's where your power is. You're not reacting, you're reflecting. You don't meet their energy, you absorb it. You don't push back, you observe. And in that gap, their facade starts to crack. Because silence removes the script. Most people rely on predictable social patterns. You say this, I say that. You accuse, I defend. But when you don't follow the script, when you don't bite, they lose their rhythm. And when someone loses their rhythm, they get clumsy. That's when their guard drops. That's when their real thoughts slip out. That's when manipulation falls apart. Because it requires your participation. You can't be manipulated if you don't respond. And Nietzsche knew that. He knew that true strength isn't in domination, it's in detachment. Control without needing control, influence without effort. Because the less you say, the more weight every glance, every breath, every pause starts to carry. You become unpredictable, and the unpredictable is always feared. In silence, you stop being a participant in the game, and become the board it's played on. But silence only works when it's intentional, not passive, not weak, not retreating. This isn't the silence of submission. It's the silence of power. It's restraint as strategy, presence as pressure. The kind of silence that makes people second-guess themselves mid-sentence. The kind that disrupts power dynamics without ever raising your voice. You don't need to insult them. They do that for you, in their own mind. You don't need to prove them wrong. They start realizing they might be. And all you did was sit with your own energy and say nothing. But let's be honest, this isn't easy. Because to stay silent, you need to kill the urge to defend yourself. You need to resist the temptation to explain, clarify, justify. And that's where most people fail, because they confuse validation with truth. Nietzsche would argue if your identity depends on being understood, you haven't really found it. That's why your silence, when used correctly, becomes radioactive. It burns through pretense, not loudly, but with quiet precision. And when someone's trying to manipulate you, guilt trip you, bait you into overreacting, you let them speak. You say nothing. And what happens? They overextend. They show their hand. They start telling on themselves. Because silence creates a vacuum, and only the insecure rush to fill it. And in that rush, they trip over their own ego. Meanwhile, you're not cold. You're not passive. You're present. You're absorbing everything, cataloging patterns, reading tension, watching contradictions emerge. That's the part no one talks about. Silence doesn't mean nothing's happening. It means everything is happening internally. It's where power builds up like pressure in a sealed chamber. And when you finally do speak, it lands like a hammer. Because now your words are rare, unexpected, earned. One sentence spoken after a long silence can demolish a conversation. Not because it was loud, but because it was accurate. Because it came from clarity, not from impulse. And in that moment, you stop being part of the chaos. You become the axis around which the chaos turns. That's real presence. That's Nietzschean power, not the loudest voice, but the one who speaks last and only when it actually matters. But if silence is a weapon, it comes with a warning, because power used unconsciously always turns on its wielder. And Nietzsche wasn't just obsessed with strength, he was obsessed with conscious strength. So in the next section, we're going deeper, because silence can expose others, but it can also expose you. Because this is where silence becomes something more than just absence. It becomes strategy. Not passive, not vague, not spiritual, tactical, psychological, active in its stillness. The kind of silence that isn't about being quiet, but about choosing how to disrupt, destabilize, and disarm. Nietzsche didn't just see silence as resistance, he saw it as creation. A tool you could shape into something that people couldn't defend against. A force that operated beneath the level of speech, where instinct and ego live. And when you know how to work at that level, without saying a word, you stop reacting to people. You start rewiring them. Let's break that down. It starts with how you carry yourself in tension. Someone challenges you, tries to provoke a reaction, even mocks or embarrasses you in front of others. The room stiffens. All eyes drift toward you. You feel the pressure to speak up, to fire back, to fix the vibe. But you don't. You don't even shift. Stillness. Your lack of response sends a ripple, not because you're powerless, but because you're untouchable. They threw a punch and it landed in air. Your refusal to participate becomes louder than anything you could say. That kind of stillness isn't retreat. It's defiance. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know what you'll do. They start spinning narratives in their own head to explain why you're not reacting. That confusion, that inner spin, that's control. The more someone pushes for your reaction and gets nothing, the more exposed they become. Because in that silence, their true motivation slips out. Their insecurity, their fear, their need for approval. Most people can't handle that. They try to break the silence just to relieve their own discomfort. But if you can hold it, you flip the power dynamic without saying a word. And once you're in that space, once you've resisted the pull to perform, you unlock something deeper. Awareness. You stop needing to speak so your mind clears. You begin to see. Not just hear, see. You start picking up details you'd normally miss. The way someone's voice trembles when they try to sound confident. The way they interrupt themselves. How they qualify every sentence with I mean or kind of or you know. You see the little tells. Subtle overcorrections, nervous eye movements, fake laughter after weak jokes. None of that is random. It's their inner world leaking out through the cracks in their persona. And while they're talking, you're collecting. Storing data. Learning their moves. Because people always reveal themselves when you let them speak uninterrupted. Especially when they think you're not analyzing. Especially when your silence makes them nervous. That kind of listening isn't passive. It's preparation. And once you understand someone, what they want, what they fear, where their identity is fragile, you no longer need to overpower them. You just need to step at the right time. Or, not at all. Which brings us to something deceptively simple. Waiting. We're so used to rushing into speech. Responding the moment someone finishes talking. But the most dominant person in any room never speaks first. They allow silence to expand between words. They let tension do the talking. When someone says something to provoke you and you just sit in it, they start second-guessing. They reread their own words. They wonder if they've overstepped, if they've made themselves look stupid, if they missed something. And it gets better. Most people can't tolerate that pause. So they'll try to fix it. They'll keep talking, rambling, over-explaining, filling the air with nervous energy. The more they speak, the more they reveal. Meanwhile, you haven't moved. You haven't said a word. But somehow you're the one in control. That's how silence manipulates reality. It shifts the frame. Because if you can stay calm during the pause, if you can treat silence as your home turf, others will start scrambling just to break the discomfort they think you're feeling. Even though you're not. You're just waiting. And there's power in that wait. Because when you do speak, eventually it lands different. Your words don't just fill space, they carry weight. Because you didn't give them out easily. You created contrast. You built suspense. You made your voice feel intentional, not reactive. And in a world full of noise, intention is magnetic. But silence can't just be consistent. If you're always calm, always quiet, always composed, people will begin to predict you. And once you're predictable, you're no longer dangerous. So there's another layer to all this, a quiet one but sharp. It's unpredictability. This is where silence stops being a posture and becomes a tactic. Some days you let a conversation pass without comment. Other days you drop one sentence and walk away. Sometimes you sit through the whole meeting without speaking once, and then the next time, you interrupt early and end it faster than anyone expected. You become a moving target, a rhythm they can't follow, a personality they can't pin down, and the uncertainty starts to gnaw at them. Because people like to know where they stand, they like to categorize you. Is he passive or assertive? Is she a threat or an ally? Is he watching me or ignoring me? And when they can't figure that out, when your silence becomes inconsistent and unreadable, they slow down. Their confidence softens. They pause to anticipate what you might do, and in that pause you move ahead of them. That's the trick. You don't need to dominate with presence. You dominate with unpredictability. You don't speak to assert control. You withhold speech until it tilts the room. Nietzsche would have loved that. Because to him the real strength wasn't brute force, it was mastery over your own impulse. The ability to delay, observe, wait, and choose your response with precision. That's what makes you powerful. Not words, not debate, composure. And the best part? These aren't tricks. They're habits. They're skills anyone can learn. But they take discipline. You have to fight the urge to prove yourself. You have to be willing to let silence do what noise can't. Unsettle, expose, and shift the balance of power. So if you've ever felt like silence made you invisible, flip the frame. Silence doesn't erase you. It sharpens you. It makes every move more deliberate, every word more valuable, every pause more loaded. This isn't about becoming cold or detached. It's about learning to control the atmosphere with nothing but your restraint. And once you learn to master that restraint, you start realizing something deeper. Something Nietzsche hinted at but never fully spelled out. You don't just use silence against others, you use it against yourself. And that's where we're headed next. Because the hardest person to outsmart is the one in your own head. We've talked about how silence dismantles manipulation, how it exposes the lies of others and your own. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Not all silence is a show of strength. Sometimes, silence is surrender. And Nietzsche was brutal about this kind of silence. He had no patience for it. Because there's a silence that looks composed on the outside, but inside it's rotting. It's the silence of the person who stays quiet because they've been taught that's what good people do. The silence of someone who's been conditioned to think that conflict is inherently wrong, that speaking up is selfish, that pushing back makes you a bad person. This isn't strategy. It's fear with a halo on top. And society loves this kind of silence because it keeps you soft, compliant, predictable. You don't cause problems. You don't take up space. You stay agreeable, even when something inside you is screaming. But Nietzsche saw right through that. He didn't just criticize society. He went after the morality that props it up. What he called slave morality, the belief system built by the weak to protect themselves from the strong. It's not about goodness. It's about safety. It's a set of rules designed to keep people from stepping out of line, to shame them for wanting power, to praise them for being passive, be humble, be agreeable, turn the other cheek. But behind those instructions is a chilling message. Don't challenge anything, don't think for yourself, don't make noise. Because if you do, you might realize you were never weak to begin with. And that kind of realization, that's dangerous to a system built on obedience. See, this kind of silence doesn't come from choice. It comes from programming. It's the silence of someone who was told too many times that their emotions were too much. That anger is wrong. That wanting more is selfish. That disagreement is aggression. So what happens? You shrink. You fold. You apologize for things that don't need an apology, and you call it maturity. But it's not maturity. It's just a habit of betraying yourself with a smile on your face. Nietzsche wasn't interested in that version of you. He didn't write for the agreeable, the compliant, the polite. He wrote for the one underneath all that, the one that knows something's off, the one that has stayed quiet for too long and doesn't even remember why anymore. He would have called this silence what it really is, a quiet kind of death. Death of your instincts, death of your will, death of your ability to say no. And the scary part? You don't even notice it happening. Because society rewards you for it. You get called easy to work with. You're praised for being low maintenance. People say you're so calm, so composed, but inside, you're disappearing. And the more you disappear, the more space others take up. Not because they're evil, but because they can sense it. People always sense when someone won't fight back, and they adapt. They speak louder. They decide faster. They lead, not because they're better, but because you've silently told them, "I won't stop you." That's not peace. That's resignation. You weren't born to nod in agreement. You weren't built to tiptoe around truth. And if your silence is coming from a place of fear, then it's not power, it's submission. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He saw how easily people are trained to obey. Not just laws, but social cues, emotional manipulation, unspoken rules. And he hated it. He knew that to live authentically, you'd have to unlearn those lessons. You'd have to disappoint people, upset people, be misunderstood. Because the alternative is to live as someone else, a ghost version of yourself, safe, liked, and completely erased. Now, none of this means you have to start yelling or picking fights or proving yourself. True rebellion doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it comes in a whisper. Or better yet, in a silence that doesn't back down. It's the silence of someone who knows they don't need to justify their boundaries. The silence of someone who can let others be uncomfortable because they're no longer willing to sacrifice themselves for other people's comfort. And that silence? That's the real kind. The kind that unsettles. The kind that reclaims space. The kind that Nietzsche would have respected. But to get there, you have to recognize when your silence is just fear dressed up as politeness. You have to catch yourself when you're shrinking. When you're staying quiet, not because you're strategic, but because you're afraid of what will happen if you finally speak. Let them react. Let them misunderstand. Let them squirm. You're not here to be a mirror for their comfort anymore. You're here to exist, fully, without apology, without guilt, without waiting for permission. That's what Nietzsche meant when he said, "You have your way, I have mine." As for the right way, the correct way, it does not exist. There's no single right way to live, but there is a wrong one. And it's the life where you never show up as yourself. So take inventory. Where are you being silent out of guilt? Where are you pretending that compliance is peace? And ask yourself this: if you keep staying silent for the rest of your life, whose life are you actually living? Because the silence of submission is not sustainable. It erodes you from the inside, slowly, quietly. Until one day you don't even remember what your voice sounded like. But there's another kind of silence, not the kind that shrinks, the kind that stands. The kind that doesn't need to prove, explain, or perform, it just is. And in that being, it commands. That's the silence Nietzsche respected. And it's the silence that marks the beginning of something else. Something more dangerous than fear, more disruptive than rage, more powerful than noise. Because when silence is no longer a symptom of weakness, it becomes a signal of transformation. And that's exactly what we'll unpack next. Let's keep going. But there's another form of silence. Not the kind that shrinks to avoid pain, but the kind that towers above it. This is where Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch enters. Not as a myth, not as a superhero, but as a state of mind, a way of being. The Übermensch doesn't go quiet out of fear or guilt. He goes quiet because there's no need to speak. He doesn't react to the world, he reorganizes it, he doesn't chase respect. He exudes it without saying a word. This is a person who no longer argues with fools, no longer debates with those committed to misunderstanding. He doesn't rely on approval, applause, or being seen as right, because to need that is to be owned by it. And he refuses ownership by anything outside himself. To become this kind of person, this evolved version of yourself, you have to kill something first. You have to kill the part of you that still flinches at disapproval, the part of you that still wants to be liked, the part of you that still believes your value is determined by how well you explain yourself. The Übermensch does not explain. He embodies, because he knows. Every time you try to convince someone of who you are, you're proving that you haven't fully become it yet. When Nietzsche spoke of overcoming, he didn't mean domination over others. He meant transcendence, outgrowing the very game people are stuck playing. He saw the average person as trapped inside borrowed beliefs, religions, social rules, tribal values. The Übermensch rips all of that away. He creates his own values, his own tempo, his own code, and silence becomes part of that code. Not passive silence, but stillness that speaks louder than chaos. This kind of presence destabilizes people, because when someone meets you and feels no neediness, no urge to be validated, no rush to impress, no craving for acceptance, they're left with one thing: the mirror. They see themselves, their overcompensations, their insecurities, their noise, and your silence becomes a confrontation. Not because you said anything, but because you didn't need to. This is power, not because you seek it, but because you've stopped needing it from anywhere but within. It's not arrogance, it's not apathy, it's not pretending to be above everything. It's knowing that you're already above the nonsense. So much of the world is built on noise, on trying to be heard, trying to be right, trying to be liked, trying to fit in. But the Übermensch doesn't try. He chooses. He decides what matters. He decides when to speak, how to speak, and most of the time he doesn't need to speak at all, because his silence says it all. And in a world of desperate voices, that silence is terrifying. It's magnetic. It draws attention not by seeking it, but by not caring if it comes. That's the paradox of presence. The less you demand from others, the more gravity you have. Nietzsche understood that real influence begins when the performance ends, when you're no longer dancing for the crowd, when you stop editing yourself to make others comfortable, and instead, you stand, quietly, fully, unapologetically. You don't avoid conflict, but you don't chase it either. You've grown past the need to win, because you know that winning isn't about overpowering someone else. It's about not being pulled into their chaos. This is the shift, from being reactive to being untouchable, from trying to control others to mastering yourself, from silence as retreat to silence as presence. And the reason this is so rare? Because most people aren't ready to carry that kind of solitude. It's heavy to not explain yourself. It's isolating to walk away from arguments you know you could win. It's difficult to exist without the constant echo of affirmation. But the Übermensch doesn't crave applause. He only seeks alignment with his values, his standards, his truth. And that truth doesn't need to be yelled to be real, because, like Nietzsche said, the higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. So let them misunderstand you. Let them underestimate you. Let them think your silence is weakness. Because when you know who you are, you don't need to prove anything. Your presence will do the speaking for you. And that's the shift most people never make. They think silence is retreat. They think it's weakness. But the truth is, silence is the highest form of control. Because the less you say, the more they reveal. The less you react, the more they question themselves. And the less you seek approval, the more they start giving it without you asking. It's not about pretending to be untouchable. It's about becoming so secure in yourself that even misunderstanding doesn't bother you anymore. That's when you stop defending your value and start embodying it. Silence becomes your filter. It exposes who's real. It reveals who's bluffing. And most of all, it protects you from becoming just another voice shouting to be heard. Nietzsche didn't write for the crowd. He wrote for those willing to think deeper, act smarter, and rise above the noise. He knew that real power doesn't look like dominance, it looks like restraint. It sounds like silence. So if this resonated with you, if something about this hit deeper than just surface-level advice, then don't let it stop here. Comment, "I choose the silence that commands respect." That's not just for the algorithm. It's your statement of intent. Like the video if this gave you something real to think about. And subscribe, because in the next one we're going even further into what Nietzsche really meant by power, and how most people never even get close to it. Stay sharp, stay silent, and let them make the noise.